Hello, we're back again. In my 3 previous videos, I have talked about Ezra's eagle and the comparisons of the eagle to the United States of America. In this video, I want to discuss another book I recently read that also has references to ancient history. The book is The Paradigm by Jonathan Cahn. My point here is not to advertise or endorse Mr. Cahn's book, but to draw upon his research regarding ancient Israel and possible links to our society today. The paradigm describes several characters from the history of ancient Israel and characterizes them as prototypes for various United States politicians in our day. There are connections between the dream of Ezra's eagle, the history of the United States, and the history of ancient Israel. The connections I will now discuss are based upon the research I did after reading the paradigm, looking for other possible ties between the two nations and the history of each nation, aside from those discussed in the paradigm by Mr. Cahn. Let's start with a timeline for the dispersion of ancient Israel, starting with the declaration of independence from the House of David by Jeroboam and the 10 northern tribes, and the years in which the Israelites were divided into kingdoms of Judah and Israel, and the eventual fall of the kingdom of Israel. You may have read that the first king of the United Kingdom of Israel and Judah, or Israel, was Saul. And he was the first king. He died in the year 1010 BC. He was followed by David, who ruled for 40 years and died in 970 BC. David was then followed by Solomon, who ruled until 931 BC. Now, before Solomon died, he made the mistake of taking wives from outside the nation of Israel and building altars in high places so that his wives could worship at those altars. We might consider that as being religiously tolerant back then. However, the Lord was not pleased with his behavior. As a result, the Lord told Solomon that the kingdom would be rent during the days of his son, and that 10 of the tribes of Israel would no longer be subject to the house of David. We don't know exactly when Solomon was told this, but it obviously had to be before he died. So shortly after Solomon's son Rehoboam began to reign, the 10 tribes demanded that the king reduce their tax burden. This brings to mind the Boston Tea Party, which precipitated the American Revolution. It might also remind you of the Tea Party movement from a few years ago, in which T was an acronym for taxed enough already. So when Rehoboam refused to reduce the taxes, they declared their independence, and Jeroboam began his reign as the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel, while Rehoboam continued to rule the southern kingdom of Judah. It was the northern kingdom of Israel where Ahab and Jezebel and their sons would rule, who were some of the kings talked about by Mr. Cahn in his book, The Paradigm. There would be a total of 19 kings in Israel, and they would serve for 240 years. Eventually, Israel would be conquered by Assyria, and the scattering of Israel out of the lands of their inheritance would begin. And over 100 years later, Judah would also be conquered, and many of its inhabitants carried off into Babylon. How might this pertain to Ezra's dream of the eagle? Interestingly enough, Ezra describes precisely 19 feathers and heads that actually rule over the kingdom represented by the eagle. These were probably not the only rulers, as he never describes any feathers that might have once appeared on the left wing of the eagle before it soared into his dream, but only those on the right wing. But these 19 rulers appeared during what are described as the final years of the nation in question. As I mentioned in my previous video, we are currently 92 years into the sequence as described by Ezra, and we still have 4 short presidential administrations to complete before the end of the eagle comes. Those administrations might realistically last between 1 and 47 months each, with elections taking place in 2024 and 2028. It's probable that the 4 administrations will conclude sometime between 2028 and 2032. So within that period, the year 2029 will mark 100 years since the first of the large feathers, Herbert Hoover, was inaugurated. 2029 will also mark the end of the 240th year of Presidents of the United States, beginning with George Washington in 1789. Now, this analysis is not intended to predict the date and time of the coming of the Messiah. There are many different methods that people have used to predict this event, and the result has never been accurate so far. I remember overhearing an elderly gentleman dressed in a white suit and tie speaking to another similarly attired man back in the early 1990s. He said that he knew when the Messiah would appear, at midnight on April 6th of the year 2000. I remember smiling and thinking to myself, well, that is one time we can now take off the list of probable dates and times, because somebody says they know. But we are directed to watch for the signs of the times so that we can be prepared, as in the parable of the 10 virgins. Therefore, let us watch together. I recently thought of another way to approximate the time of the Messiah. In the revelation of St. John the Divine, the history of the world is divided into 7 periods which are associated with the opening of 7 seals in the Lamb's Book of Life. Biblical history goes back to about 4,000 years before Christ, and we now have passed 2,000 years after the birth of Christ. If each of the seals covers a 1,000-year period, then we may have reached the period described at the opening of the seventh seal. Now, upon the opening of the 7th seal, we read that there was silence in heaven for about half an hour, following which plagues and tribulations are poured out upon the earth for about 7 years, at which point the Messiah comes. At least, that is the story that many Christians have been taught. But how long is a half hour in heaven? Peter writes that in the Lord's time, one day is as 1,000 years of our time here on earth. By the way, did I tell you that I like math? If you divide 1,000-year-long day into 48 equal periods of half an hour, the result is that half an hour in heaven would be 20.833 years on earth, or 20 years and 10 months. If we were to assume that the 7th seal was opened on January 1st, 2001, the first day of this millennium as we measure time, and we add in 20.833 years, and then 7 more years of tribulation before the Messiah comes, we would arrive at midnight, between the end of October, Halloween, and November 1st, All Saints' Day of 2028. This would also be 6 days before the presidential election in the year 2028, and a couple of months before the inauguration in 2029. This sounds like it might be an intriguing time for the Messiah to come. Perhaps this calculation is precisely why 1 November is called All Saints' Day, and 31 October is called All Hallows' Eve. Could be, I don't know, but it's an interesting little thought. But that calculation depends upon the assumption that the Lord's time is accurately measured using the Julian calendar. Even the years of the Julian calendar, which were once described in terms of the years before and after Christ's birth, have been called into question, with some estimates indicating that Christ may have actually been born as many as 6 years earlier than was once suggested by the calendar. Nevertheless, the estimate from this calculation is pretty consistent with the scenario suggested by Ezra's eagle. It has been said that no man knoweth the day nor the hour of the coming of the Messiah. This is why I smiled when I heard the man in white say that he knew when it would happen. Many people say that we should not try to ascertain when the Messiah will come because it's a mystery, and we should not waste our time speculating about mysteries. But the Bible is full of admonitions to seek understanding, even of the mysteries. In another of Jonathan Cahn's books, The Book of Mysteries, appropriately named, he points out that in the Hebrew tradition, the phrase, "no man knoweth the day nor the hour," is said not about the appearance of the Messiah, but of the Jewish New Year celebration of Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah occurs on the first day of a lunar month, which begins with the appearance of the new moon, usually in the Julian calendar months of late September or early October. But in the ancient tradition, The new year begins not precisely when the new moon occurs, but when two witnesses enter the temple in Jerusalem and declare to the high priest that they have seen the new moon following the autumn equinox. So regardless of when the new moon actually occurs, according to the Jewish tradition, Rosh Hashanah only begins when the two witnesses actually show up and tell the high priest. Is this a coincidence, or is it possibly a reference to the time of year when the Messiah will come? I believe there's yet another paradigm at work here. In John's Revelation, chapter 11, we read that prior to the coming of the Messiah, there will be two prophets or witnesses who will testify in Jerusalem for 1,260 days, or about 42 months, or 3.5 years, and will smite the earth with drought and plagues. This is supposedly during the last half of that 7-year tribulation. When their testimony is complete, they will be killed, and their bodies will lie in the street for 3.5 days, while people around the world rejoice that they have died. After 3.5 days, the two prophets shall be resurrected in full view of those watching, and will ascend into heaven shortly before the Messiah comes. Are the two witnesses who tell the high priest in Jerusalem that they have seen the new moon to begin the celebration of Rosh Hashanah a paradigm for the two prophets just prior to the coming of the Messiah? I think so, because in both cases, quote, no man knoweth the day nor the hour. And maybe, just maybe, this might actually occur at Rosh Hashanah. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me drone on and on and on about things we might like to see over the next that we might see over the next decade or so. If you have questions, or if there are other paradigms you would like me to address, please ask. Now, some of you may have noticed that behind me there's a painting. And you may wonder why I would be sitting in front of this particular painting, in front of this weird-looking wallpaper. Well, this painting was painted by a friend of mine, and it's referred to as On Sacred Ground. And if you look carefully, you will notice that this painting is of a field, and there are flowers in the field. There you have it. You know, me and Ezra, we were like this. This is as close as I could get to sitting in a field and still having power to operate my camera. So you have a great day, and we will talk again soon. Thank you. Bye.